Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the webinar presentation on Maryland's new wage transparency laws. I am Tiffany Jones, Outreach Coordinator for the Division of Labor and Industry of the Maryland Department of Labor. I'll be assisting with moderating this meeting. For your information, we will be recording. We know there's a lot of interest in these laws, so we want to spend as much time as we can on questions. Questions should be submitted through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat or the raise hand function due to audience size. You may submit a question anonymously if you wish. There is no need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit. We have a team ready for continuous review. Please keep in mind when you submit that we will be prioritizing questions that are more general interest rather than about a specific workplace or situation. Also, our time is limited, so we may not be able to get all questions answered today. If we don't get to your question, please stay tuned. We will likely be updating our guidance, and when we do, we will let everyone know and post it on our website. And you can always submit questions through the workrights@maryland.gov email. We'll begin with an overview presentation by our wage supervisor, Alan Griffith Jr. Then we'll go straight into answering submitted questions. Alan, please go ahead.
Good morning. We're going to talk about two new laws today that deal with transparency. Both laws require employers to give more or more specific information to workers and to do it in writing. Both of these laws were passed in the most recent General Assembly session, and both are effective October 1st of this year. Both laws are enforced solely by the Division of Labor and Industry. The law did not create any private right of action. We'll start with an overview of SB 38, Chapter 305, the pay stub or pay statement law. The pay statement law is now a part of the Maryland Wage Payment and Collection Law, Title 3 of the Labor Employment Article, Subtitle 5. The law requires two new things. First, the law had previously required that employers give notice at the time of hire of the rate of pay, the regular pay dates, and leave benefits. This law requires that notice to be in writing. Second, the law requires that pay statements be provided to employees for each pay period, that the pay statements provide specific information and that it be in writing. We'll talk about what in writing means in a moment, but generally it means either physical hard copy or electronic. But it does not mean something, but it does mean something visible and provided to the worker. Who is covered by this law? The same employers currently covered by the Wage Payment and Collection Act, which are most private sector employers, but not public sector employers. What form must the information be provided in? It may be physical or electronic, or both. Some employers maintain some of their information, like hours worked, tipped information, on a separate online system. So long as that information is available to employees on pay days by simply logging in, continuing to provide information through that system is likely to satisfy the law. As to the frequency, the statement must be provided with each pay period. Okay, let's get to the substance. What is the information that has to be provided? Looking first at earnings, the employer must in general provide hours that are being paid, the rate at which the work was compensated, and a breakdown of other non-hourly compensation. Each rate, the hours worked, and the rate should be broken out. Or if the worker is paid by the piece, each piece rate must be described in terms of per piece unit. and the number of units must be identified for each piece rate category. Please note hours worked at piece rates must also be included to ensure minimum wage and overtime compliance, even if workers are not paid by the hour. Salaried workers should have a salary amount listed, and any other category of compensation should be identified and the amount broken out. Commissions, bonus, tips, special pay, anything. The guideline is for employers, show your work. The worker should be able to look at the pay stub and determine whether they were paid correctly. Next, list each deduction by purpose and amount separately. Total gross pay and net pay earned during the period must be provided as well. It's important to note that under the Maryland Healthy Working Family Act, employers must provide workers with a written statement or electronic statement of their available sick and safe leave balances. This is not part of the pay stub law itself, but it must be provided. And we recommend that employers report it on the pay stubs unless they already have a different system in place. Okay, I'm going to spend a few minutes on the template. The template is optional. No employer has to use it, but it is a safe harbor. If you complete the template correctly, that will consider compliant with the law. The template is a best practice document. Not everything on the template is required, but everything that is required is on the template. This is a screenshot of the first section of the template. The template is an Excel spreadsheet and can be customized to suit virtually any arrangement. A couple things to note. The employer name must be as registered with ESTAT. Pay date, the start date of the pay period are also required by law. We recommend that employers also identify whether an employee is exempt from overtime so that the pay received is more easily understood by the worker. But that is a best practice and is not required by law. The earnings section of the template breaks down hourly pay by different rates, as you'll see, and piece rates similarly by the base or unit of pay. Hours worked is essentially for each of these rows. You'll see the box of salary earnings, if applicable, which doesn't require hours to be reported. And you'll see all the boxes, the other compensation in multiple categories as we discussed. Finally, the deductions and leave section of the templates are relatively self-explanatory. Each deduction must be identified and the amount reported. Leave, as we discussed, the available sick and safe leave balance must be provided, and we recommend putting it on the pay stub unless you have another system. We recommend as best practice breaking out the other leave and adding balances, usage, and accrual figures. This is not required by law, but there is space to report the information on our template. Finally, you'll see gross earnings, deductions, and net pay so that employees can easily see what they started with and what they got in their pockets. And that's it. I'll touch quickly on the legal enforcement process. The law provides an administrative order to correct deficiencies and give the commissioner power to impose civil penalties of up to $500 per employee. The amount of these penalties assessed depends on the size of the business, the gravity of violation, the good faith of the employer, and a history of violations. A contest must be filed within 15 days, or else the order becomes a final order. Contested cases are referred to our Assistant Attorney General and heard at the Office of Administrative Hearings. This slide just emphasizes the point of the law to give employees information and requires employers to show their work. Moving to the job posting transparency law, the other law going into effect on October 1st. This law amends the Equal Pay Law, Title III of Labor and Employment Article, Subtitle 3. The law requires employers to disclose the wage or salary range, in general, description of benefits, and other compensation offered to all internal and external job postings. Which employers are covered? Public sector and private sector employers are covered by the Equal Pay Law, so they are covered by this requirement as well. Which postings are covered? All external and internal postings for a position, including by a recruiter or third party. But postings by an aggregate who scrapes the internet for jobs are not covered. The employer has to consent to the posting. Which positions are covered? The work has to be physically performed, at least in part, in Maryland. Outside companies who employ workers who work remotely in Maryland may be covered. Let's look at wage salary range requirements. The law says that the range listed must be set in good faith. It gives some examples of what good faith might include, such as using a salary scale, basing the range on the compensation provided to others doing the same or similar work, or the budget set by the organization. This is not an exclusive list. What the law is saying is don't pick a number out of the air, base it on something. Looking at the general description of benefits, you need to include a benefit that, you do not need to include benefits that are required by law, such as sick and safe leave. You do not need to provide chapter or verse from your benefits. So, like the example says here, you don't need to print out your declarations of coverage for health insurance, but you do need to say the position may be eligible for single or family health care, if that's the case. And any other compensation is broad. It means variable compensation like sales commissions, profit sharings, or stock options. It means tips or portions of service charges. It means bonuses. The point, again, is that everyone who is applying for the job should know the basics of what is being offered so that everyone starts with the same information. So what happens if you post and don't have the required disclosures? You need to make those disclosures immediately before a compensation discussion is held, and certainly any time the applicant asks for them. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Again, we have developed a template as a safe harbor for employers. Again, this is optional. And again, it is a best practice document. Not everything that is on the template is required by law, but everything that is required by law is on the template. This is a fillable, downloadable PDF, and I'll go through it quickly. The general information is self-explanatory. We have included the kind of information that employers generally include in their postings, such as title, location, whether it is a full or part-time, things like that. Here you choose whether the job is hourly, salary, or has another arrangement, which you may describe. We've got check boxes for other kinds of compensation, and we've got check boxes in the benefits section for the kinds of benefits, insurance, retirement, leave, holidays the employer might offer. We encourage employers to offer more information, such as the amount of leave or holidays, but the level of detail is not expressly required by the law. In all of those cases, there is an option for customization under the other options. As we've said, an employer doesn't need to use the templates. The FAQ have other examples of potential postings, including some that are just narrative. The point is to include the information however you do it. A word about record keeping. The law requires employers to keep 3 years worth of records. This is similar to the law requiring 3 years worth of wage records. Turning to enforcement. Again, this is enforced solely by the Division of Labor and Industry, no private right of action. Enforcement is through the existing administrative process under the Equal Pay Law. The law sets out the scheme, which begins with an order compelling compliance by the employer, and then an escalation penalty structure. This is all subject to notice and hearing requirements, with the hearings at the Office of Administrative Hearings. Just to return us to the point of the law, which is to make sure that all applicants and employees have information about the general terms that the employer is offering, and that those terms are the same for the entire pool, which promotes the aims of the Equal Pay Law. Before I close the presentation for questions, there are 2 points I want to make. First, retaliation is prohibited. Employees who exercise their right, who ask for their pay stubs or asked for the disclosure when they are interviewed for a job, are protected from adverse actions for doing so. That's true for employees who exercise their rights under the Maryland labor standard laws, such as workplace fraud, prevailing wage, occupational health and safety. Retaliation is against Maryland law. Second, there are many ways to comply with these laws: electronic, hard copy, existing systems, templates. Some combination of these is fine, as long as the information is provided to the people at the time it should be provided. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Tiffany for some Q&A.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks for all those questions. Let's get right into it. Here's our first question. Does each pay stub have to include actual leave balances?
Good question. Employers subject to the Maryland Healthy Working Family Act must provide employees with certain information about their leave balances and accruals. That information must be reported on the pay stub. It can also be reported or made available elsewhere, like through an online portal, so long as the employee can access that information independently. If other leave is provided, such as annual leave or personal leave, that information is encouraged to be reported, but is not required.
Great. Here's another question, Alan. Is an online link to leave balance sufficient to comply with the law, or does the employer have to give an actual hard copy of leave accruals?
An online link is fine. The law, as long as the employee can access their leave balances at any time. So as long as they have access, an online link is completely acceptable.
Thank you. At the time of hire, can an employer provide a link to an employee handbook, or is a hard copy of the employee handbook required to comply with the notice requirement for leave benefits?
Yeah, again, an online link complies with the requirements of the law as long as the employee can access the handbook at any time.
Great. Are household employees covered by the pay stub law?
Yes, the law applies to any person who employs an individual in the state or successor of that person.
Thank you. Are part-time employees covered by the pay stub law?
Yes, the law applies to any person who employs individuals in the state or a successor of that person.
Next question. Is a single member LLC covered by the pay stub law?
If the individual is covered an employee for the purpose of other laws, it is likely that they would be considered an employee for the purpose of the pay stub law as well. A single member LLC may want to seek legal advice on this question, though.
Thank you. Next question. The effective date of the law is October 1, but what if my pay period begins before October 1 and ends after October 1? Do I have to provide a pay statement for that period?
We encourage employers to provide this information sooner if they can do so, but we are interpreting the law to apply to pay periods that begin on or after October 1st.
Thank you. Next question. Does employer name, address, telephone number need to be placed in a certain location on the pay stub? We get quite a few questions about this, including does employer contact information need to be placed at the top? What if there are three sections to a pay stub and employer contact info is only on the top of three pay stubs? Does it need to be on all sections?
The law does not specify the exact location of the employer's contact information on the pay stub. It is recommended that the employer has a multiple page stub, that the employer make every effort to ensure that the contact information is readily accessible to the employee.
Thank you. Next question. Should the pay stub have the employer's telephone number or payroll provider telephone number?
Yeah, the pay stub should have the employer's telephone number directly for the employer, not the payroll service.
Thank you. If an employer is not located in Maryland, but has employees working remotely in Maryland, what telephone number should be provided?
An employer should provide a telephone number that provides the employee with access to someone that can assist the employee with questions about their pay. That's the most important thing.
Nice, thank you. What should employers do if they have concerns about the ability of their software to comply with the law?
The pay statement template developed by the department is in Excel and can be customized to add rows or other information. Any special software is not required to generate a pay statement. It can be in the form or format as long as the information is provided. Still, if an employer feels that software challenges pose a barrier to complying with the law, please reach out to the department.
Thank you. Next question. What if an employer's payroll system and leave systems are completely separate? How can an employer ensure that they are in compliance?
So long as between them, these systems can generate the required information, and as long as the employer provides workers with the required information at the time it is needed to be provided, it is fine to have separate systems.
Thank you. Next question. If an employer has a tip pooling arrangement, does the new law in Maryland require that employers show all of the tips that were left to an employee, or only the final amount paid to the individual employee under the tip pooling arrangements?
Tips are considered other compensation under the law and must be reported and broken out separately on a pay statement. Under a tip pool arrangement, all participants are allocated a certain amount of earnings from the tip pool. The pay statement should reflect the final amount of tips allocated to the employee from the tip pool.
Thank you. For the posting transparency law, is a link and a posting to wage range of benefits okay?
Yes, as long as the required information is included in the link and it is easily accessible.
Thank you. Does a posting comply if the wage ranges are included via a QR code?
Yes, similarly, as long as the required information is included via the QR code and is easily accessible.
Thank you. Does the law require that I post all job opportunities, or may I still recruit and hire by word of mouth?
No, the law does not specify how employers may recruit. The law obligates employers to post either external or internally to fill positions to disclose certain specific information.
Great. Here's the next question. I have job postings up right now with closing dates after October 1. Do I have to pull them down and redo them so they are compliant with the law?
No, the law applies to postings that are made on or after October 1st of 2024. However, it is also applies to reposting of positions. So if you don't fill a position and have to repost after October 1st, this law would apply.
Thank you. On the benefits description, how detailed does it have to be? I see on your template that there are questions, there are places to identify how many holidays, for example. Is that level of detail required?
The law refers to general description of benefits. The description does not have to incorporate all the details about eligibility rules and amounts. For example, if I'm an employer offering health insurance, the insurance declaration need not be included. But employers should identify that health insurance coverage is offered, for example, that perhaps the insurance is for single and family coverage. That should be specifically drawn out.
Thank you. Must my job posting include benefits that are required by law, such as jury duty leave?
No, benefits that are required by the law are available to all employees on an equal basis. The point of the law is to identify through a general description those benefits that the employer offers above and beyond what is legally required to ensure that the benefits are offered to all applicants for the position if otherwise qualified.
Thank you. Alan, recruiting on social media is increasingly common. Is the social media post linked to the job posting and the job posting contains all of the required information? Will that comply with the law, or must the social media post also contain the same required information?
If the social media post links to a compliant job posting, the posting and the social media advertisement will be compliant.
That's excellent. Thank you, Alan. We're going to give you a bit of a break here and finish the Q&A with Commissioner Devkeverk. Commissioner, here is your first question. Do hours and rates still need to be listed if the business is seasonal and the position is exempt from overtime?
If the position is exempt from overtime, then hours and rates don't need to be listed. But whether a job is seasonal, full-time, part-time, does not affect the analysis. The pay stub law applies and covers the employers and employees covered by the wage payment and collection law, which, as Alan noted earlier, is private sector, most private sector employers in Maryland.
Thank you. Here's your second question. Is there a limitation on how large a salary range can be?
Well, the salary range that's on the posting should be set in good faith. That's what the law requires. So, a salary range from, I don't know, $50,000 to $500,000. Again, I guess it's conceivable that there's a good faith basis for having a range that broad. But again, the touchstone here is good faith. If there has to be a reasonable, legitimate basis on which the range is set. So it's not about how broad the range is, because ranges and amounts that people are compensated at can be affected by a number of different factors, including seniority, experience, credentials, any number of things, and the law recognizes that. What the law says is that the range that's listed on the posting has to be what the employer in good faith intends to pay for that position.
Thank you. Next question. Can an employer email pay stubs to employees and still be compliant with the law?
Yes. The key here is, again, for employers, as Alan put it concisely, to show their work to employees and give employees enough information that they can determine whether they were paid correctly for that pay period. The form or format is less important than having and providing all of the information to the employees who need it in a timely fashion. So to answer the question, yes, it may be emailed. It may even, some of the information may be in a separate system, so long as all of the information is accessible to the employee and available to the employee independently on payday, the employer will be compliant.
Thank you. Do job postings have to provide the name of the employer?
No, they do not. If you look, we understand that, I think the law recognizes that employers sometimes use recruiting agents or third parties to conduct recruiting for them. The template that the department developed actually has a drop-down menu on the left-hand side where you can choose whether you're an employer, recruiter, an agent. Obviously, if you choose not to use the template, then you don't have to use the drop-down menu. But to answer the question, no, it does not have to provide the name of the employer who is doing the hiring.
Thank you. Are employers required to indicate on the pay stub whether their employee is overtime, exempt, or not?
The law does not require it. We recommend, as Alan pointed out, as a best practice, and in the template pay stub that the department developed, there's a space to indicate whether an employee is exempt or not, because that helps employees understand their pay, but that is not a requirement of the law.
Thank you. Next question. If an employer is located outside of Maryland and has one or more remote employees working in Maryland, does the pay transparency law apply?
So when we say the pay transparency law, I'm assuming this is the job posting transparency law, the SB 525. I think the answer in that law that law gives is that if the work is to be performed physically in whole or in part in the state of Maryland, the law applies. So if you're an out-of-state company and you're recruiting for remote workers, and you're recruiting in Maryland, and you would hire somebody in the state of Maryland who would then perform some of the work, maybe all of the work physically in Maryland, then your recruiting materials have to comply with the disclosures under SB 525. I hope that answered the question.
It does. What does the pay statement law require at the time of hire and for each pay period?
So that's a great question. The law currently under the Wage Payment and Collection Act requires that employers give notice at the time of hire of certain elements, including, I believe, I'm trying to find the law here, the notice of rates of pay, pay days, and leave benefits. That's always been required. But under the new law, it is required to be given in writing. So the same information, but just in writing. So an offer letter, for instance, could include that information, or the information could be, again, in an email. The point is, again, that information about those very basic elements. What is the rate of pay? What is, whether it's an annual salary, the annual salary rate, if it's a hourly rate, I think the position, the straight time rate, if it's paid on commission, what is, that there is a commission arrangement, that information now has to be in writing.
Great, thank you.
Oh,
How soon?
sorry, Tiffany. There was a second half of the question. What is the information, I think, that has to be disclosed on the pay stub? That information is more specific because it's intended to help employees understand how their pay was calculated for that pay period. What are the elements that went into it, and how the employer formulated the pay. So there are multiple elements that need to be on the pay stub that do not need to be on the notice of hire. Let me just back up for a moment. I think probably a number of people are wondering, can I get this presentation, or will this webinar be available? And I think I'm authorized to say we are recording for a reason, and that reason is that we're going to, once the recording is done and the webinar is complete, and the rendering is done in whatever way the technology does it, we're going to post it on our website. And as Tiffany said way at the beginning, certainly the kinds of questions that we're getting are really helpful to us in formulating, more guidance or more specific guidance for the regulated community and for workers, and posting that on our website. And when we do both of those things, post the webinar recording and any new guidance, we'll blast that out to the lists again. And I believe, Tiffany, maybe before we end, you can let folks know how they can sort of subscribe, if there's a function for that, or an email that they can send their address to, so that they get those notices from Labor and Industry when we post additional information that could be helpful with compliance. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Hopefully I answered the question as well, but I wanted to make sure that that information got out there to the whole group.
Thank you for both. Here's your next question. How soon after a payday must a pay statement be provided?
It needs to be provided on the payday. The information, whenever the employee gets paid, that's the payday. That's the date that the information needs to be disclosed to the employee.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. Does the pay statement law apply to employers who are located outside of Maryland, but have an employee working in Maryland?
Yes. The laws of Maryland generally apply to employees who work, again, perform their work physically in whole or in part within the state of Maryland.
Thank you. Does an employer have to advise employees of the new law? Perhaps is there a posting requirement?
It's a great question. The law itself does not contain a posting requirement, but it's certainly something that, again, as a voluntary matter, we think is a best practice, and we will work to try to develop a posting for employers to use within our guidance materials. But it is not a required. There's no required posting provision in the law.
Thank you. How should an employer report pay that is not based on an hourly rate, such as commissions or piecework?
This is a great question, and shows the ways in which the multitude of ways in which pay can be calculated, and I think underscores really the need for transparency to workers as well. So the piece rate question is right in the law. The law requires that the piece rates, including the basis of the pay and the rate of pay, be disclosed. And if there are different piece rates, that the different piece rates be disclosed as well. If you're paying someone by the window or you're paying someone by the bushel, and those rates are different depending on, you know, either what types of window or what types of produce, you know, those differing rates do need to be disclosed. And the number of units that the worker is being paid for within the pay period also need to be disclosed on the pay stub. Some employers who do this have, again, a separate place where they calculate this information. And our suggestion, I think, as Alan said multiple times, although, again, it's a best practice to have everything on the pay stub, and the template that the department developed does contemplate piece rates and contemplates multiple piece rates being paid to the same employee, and again, is customizable in the way that Excel is customizable. Many employers have a separate system to do this. And as Alan said repeatedly, it is fine to continue using that system so long as the information or the report is provided to the employee that gives them all of the information that they need to determine whether they were paid correctly, how many pieces they were paid for, at what rate during that pay period. As long as you're doing that and providing that to the employee on payday, you are compliant. And when I say providing, I think this is clear, but it needs to be something that's essentially the functional equivalent of handing it to the person to keep. So if it's, say, continuously available on an online portal, or you email them the spreadsheet, or you hand them a separate printout, all of those are perfectly fine. The point is to get the information in the worker's hands, and so that they can have it as a reference, because it's their pay and they need to understand it.
Thank you. You actually led into our next question. What does continuous access to electronic pay stubs mean?
So it means, you know, there are some questions about whether employees, say, who have separated from the company, still have access to the employer's online portal. I don't know that we're prepared to answer that question at the moment, but certainly during the time that employees are employed, if an employer has an online portal or an electronic system by which all of these elements of pay are maintained, as long as employees have, you know, continuous access to that. Everyone understands that some systems always have to be updated and go down for maintenance on a routine basis, but otherwise, if they can log in at, you know, 1 o'clock in the morning, or they can log in at, you know, 7 a.m. and find that information, then that system would be compliant. I hope that that answers the question. There are obviously many, many different kinds of systems that employers use. And again, I come back to the fundamental function of the law, which is to provide employees with sufficient information to make a determination as to whether they were paid correctly. That is the lodestar. And that's why, as Alan said, you know, the real question for employers is, have you shown your work? So we understand that it can be electronic. Again, it can be physical, but as long as employees have access to it on demand of the employee, they don't have to go to somebody's office. They don't have to get special permission. It's theirs in the same way that a physical pay stub would be theirs to reference. I hope that answers that question.
That's excellent. Thank you, Commissioner. Your next question. Do employers have to post the wage range for merit-based promotions, or does the new law only apply to competitive promotions?
That's a good question. I mean, it applies on its terms to all internal and external postings. I think if you are advertising or recruiting for the position, then the terms and disclosures under the law must be made. If you already know who it is that you want to promote and you're simply going to promote them, again, as Alan said, the law does not require employers to post for every position. But if they are seeking candidates for a position and they are recruiting for a position, the information needs to be disclosed.
Thank you. Does the pay stub have to specify how the employer calculated the amount of commission?
Let me just finish my answer to the previous question, because
My apologies.
I just grabbed the law on the posting to check myself. The law itself on the wage range transparency defines posting as a, quote, solicitation intended to recruit applicants for a specific available position, including recruitment done directly by an employer or indirectly through a third party. So I think that may answer the previous question about whether if someone, if an employer wishes to promote an employee, a specific employee internally, whether they have to post. I think the answer is no, not unless you are recruiting via solicitation, quote, intended to recruit applicants for a specific available position. So I hope that answers that question. Sorry, give me the question on pay stub again. It's on commission, how much of the work you have to show.
Yes.
I feel like this is similar to the piece rate determination. Again, individual workers need to have an understanding about how their pay was calculated. If they are paid on a commission basis or a fee for service basis or a piece rate basis, we understand that there can be multiple different rates that might apply, and multiple different formulas or calculations that could apply. Again, the touchstone, there are so many different variations on this. I come back to the touchstone, which is employers have to show their work sufficiently that employees know how the pay was calculated. So if that means breaking out commissions for different types of sales, then it means breaking out commissions for different types of sales if those sales are paid at different rates. In the same way that an employer who employs people who may get paid at different rates, either for different jobs, say work in different classifications can be subject to different rates, or paid overtime, or paid a shift differential for overnight work. All of those rates do have to be listed separately and broken out, and the hours paid at each rate have to be listed separately and broken out. So I would say that's an analog for both commissions, piece rates, fee for service in the same way. It requires, again, sufficient transparency that an employee would be able to determine how their pay was calculated. But again, when an employer comes up with the lump sum, all of those calculations have been performed somewhere. What we're saying is show your work, show those calculations so that employees know what those rates are and what they are getting paid for at each rate. I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you. Commissioner, your next question. What should an employer do if its accounting software, such as a QuickBooks, does not generate all of the required information?
So as I think Alan said, look, if you have software issues, just please reach out to us. The purpose of the law is to provide information to workers, or in the case of the pay range law, to existing applicants or candidates, potential candidate pool. We want to try to help. That's why we have the compliance materials that we do. Again, I come back to the notion that wherever the calculation itself is performed, it may not be as clean. It may be, say, two different statements, one generated by QuickBooks and one generated in the background, perhaps, that feeds into QuickBooks. If you're providing both of them and they can together show the required information. It's not required to be all in one place. We think that's the best practice because it's just simpler for workers. But again, if your systems have constraints, and some of them may, it is permissible to use a combination of reports, a pay statement and then a breakdown together to give workers the information that they need.
Thank you. What if an employee is paid hourly, but at different rates of pay depending on the type of work performed?
Yes, a great question and a very common one. The answer is that each rate of pay and the hours worked at each rate of pay need to be broken out on the pay stub. And the reason for that is that if just a lump sum and a total number of hours is provided, it is difficult for an employee to know, for instance, if they were entitled to overtime pay, how many of those hours listed are overtime hours. So you would, in that case, have to break out the straight time rate and the straight time hours, the overtime rate and the overtime hours. Or if an employee was working on straight time, but in two different classifications that pay different rates, classification one, rate one, number of hours worked in classification one during that pay period. Classification two, rate two, list the rate, list the number of hours worked at that rate.
Thank you. And this may allude to this next question. If an employee works under a joint employment arrangement, does the employee need to receive a pay stub from each individual employer?
The law doesn't specifically address that. I think we would have to think about that situation. Normally, in a joint employer situation, one of those employers is responsible for actually doing the administrative work. And I think that would be, again, sufficient. I would suggest that in a joint employer situation like that, you could provide one pay statement and list both employers, or however many employers there are, at the top of the pay stub.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next question. Does the pay stub have to reflect the total annual salary or just the salary paid for that pay period?
Yeah, another great question, and one that maybe our template is not quite equal to. The short answer is you don't have to list the annual salary on the pay statement. In the notice of hire, if it's the position is a salaried position, the annual salary should be listed. But on the pay stub itself, it's just the gross amount of salary for that pay period. I think we probably had some questions. I've seen them come in before the webinar also about whether year-to-date figures are necessary on the pay stub. And the answer to that is they're not. They're certainly helpful, and many programs can generate those automatically, but they are not required by the law.
Thank you. So next question, must piece rates be listed on the pay stub if they are variable and the employee has access to the rates separately in a document that set forth the previous piece rates? Should I restate that? Reread that?
No, I think I'm just thinking about how to answer it. I think again, what the rate is and what the number of units are that are paid at that rate during the pay period should be on the pay statement. If the question is even if there are multiple different rates, each rate, if it is a different rate, needs to be broken down, because again, it is difficult if the point here of the law is to provide workers with the information they need to determine, I know that I did X number of these kinds of pieces and Y number of these kinds of pieces. A lump sum is not going to be sufficient for a worker to back out whether or not they were paid correctly. So the number of units and the rate should be provided to the worker. Does it need to be on a quote pay statement, or can it be in some other form? Again, as I've said, a number of employers have fully functioning back-end systems that identify what the rates are and what they're for, and calculate each employee's rate separately. As long as a report can be generated for the employee that includes that information, and either stapled to the pay stub or given to them at the same time, that would satisfy the law. Again, the point is that workers should be able to follow your calculation so that they can check it against their own memory or their own records and determine whether they were paid correctly. And if they think they weren't, be able to raise those issues with the employer sooner rather than later. So if there was any correction necessary, that it's done as soon as possible.
Thank you. That's excellent. Here's your next question. There are many questions in the Q&A about leave balances. Can you reiterate what is required, please?
Yes. So the law itself, the pay stub law that we're speaking of, does not require leave balances or accruals or usage to be on the pay statement. Let me say that again. The pay stub law does not require that leave balances, accruals, or leave usage be on the pay statement. The template that the department developed has those fields, and we encourage employers to provide that information to workers, but it does not have to be by law on the pay stub. So under that, the second part of the question, though, is what does an employer need to provide to workers in terms of leave information or leave balances on a regular basis? And as Alan pointed out, this is not under the pay stub law, it's under the Healthy Working Families Act. For employers covered by that act, for covered employees, they must provide employees with a written statement of the available leave balance. Our suggestion is if you can place that information on the pay stub, then the employee has it all in one place. But again, it is not required that the leave balance information that is required under the Healthy Working Families Act be placed on the pay stub.
That's excellent. Thank you. Here's your next and last question. If an employer utilizes an online pay stub, which details the rate of pay, does this satisfy the written notice requirement at the time of hire?
I guess I feel like the notice of hire and the pay stub information are two separate obligations by the employer. The notice of hire has to be at the time of hire. And in general, a pay stub is produced after an employee starts working. So everything depends on the facts and circumstances, but it feels to me that the notice of hire information needs to be provided at the time of hire. And again, that information is relatively slim. It is the, sorry, I'm going to go back to the actual law. It's the notice of the rates of pay, the paydays, and the leave benefits. Those have to be in writing. And I don't know if this is in our FAQs. If not, we may amend to put them in, to put something in about this. But many employers have a handbook that describes, say, what the leave benefits are. And it is fine to just simply provide a copy of that handbook to people at the time of hire. It doesn't need to be in some sort of separate magical notice, as long as employees, again, get the information at the time of hire that's required to be given at the time of hire. That's fine. But I think by the time an employee is entitled to actually be paid, that is going to be after the time of hire. So at least based on my understanding of the question, that would not satisfy the employer's obligation to provide written notice at the time of hire of rates of pay, paydays, and leave benefits.
That's excellent. Commissioner, I believe we are out of time. That went really fast. Again,
it really did.
It did. If we didn't get to your question, we apologize. We couldn't get to them all, but watch your email and our website for any updates for a guidance. We appreciate everyone's time and attention to these important issues. We'll do our best to get the recording of this webinar reviewed and posted as soon as possible. And with that, have an excellent day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.